I'm delighted to launch the UK Health Alliance's agreed policy position on food, health and the climate called All Consuming. You've been sent a link to it. Please read it, share it, tweet about it. And the benefits of virtual launches like this is that we're able to invite more guests. So while we all have our member organisations, we have our member organisations represented here, and a lot of the people that be on the call are people who help develop the content of All Consuming. We also have some new people from environmental NGOs, from other health bodies, from government and from the private sector. So I'll briefly take an opportunity to introduce the Alliance to you, if I may. So these are our members of the Alliance. There are 21 current members of the UK Health Alliance on climate change. We were set up in 2016. Our members include many of the Royal Medical Colleges, the BMA. Our largest member is the Royal College of Nursing. We have some small specialist societies and some faculties, and also two UK journals, the Lancet and the BMJ. And we exist to advocate for responses to climate change that protect and promote our health. And we do this in a number of ways. We do this through our collective voice in advocacy. We reflect on our own individual behaviour and reforming our organisations. So a lot of our members have already divested from fossil fuels. Many have developed policy positions. For example, the Royal College of Psychiatrists have an excellent position on how nature and green-based solutions support mental health. And increasingly, we're thinking about the NHS, especially with the launch of the Greener NHS programme. What happens in a clinical setting that supports people from before birth to death and everything in between? So what does sustainable general practice look like? How do we perform surgery in a sustainable way? How do we support patients with mental health issues? What happens in our emergency departments? We want to make this as sustainable as possible, because we know that UK healthcare systems are responsible for 5% of all UK emissions. So climate threatens the availability of safe and sufficient food, resulting from water scarcity, reduced yields, nutritional quality of crops, as well as pest and vector migration. But the way we produce and consume food also contributes to climate change. The Alliance recognises that the food system is an area that needs to be addressed if the United Kingdom will meet its commitments under the Paris Agreement, and it's an area where significant health co-benefits can be realised. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report makes it clear once again that in order to keep global temperatures to a safe level, we can't do that unless we transform the way we produce food and manage land. Between 20 to 30% of global carbon emissions come from agriculture and food, and about half of all methane emissions come from cattle or rice fields alone. And food waste in the UK is going into landfill and creates 20 million tonnes of methane a year. So it's very obvious and very simple. We can't meet our current climates without changing our food system. And it's also very simple that we can do something about our food system and the food that we eat that makes us more healthy and more resilient. But in a way, that's all that is simple, because I'm sure all of you know, food is an extremely complex issue. The food we eat is a very emotional issue. The way we produce our food is a very controversial issue. So I'm delighted that we're joined by some experts today who will be able to give us a bit more information about food and climate, how they talk to their patients, how they manage foods in hospital system, and the emerging government thoughts on a national food strategy. In the report, we come up with a series of recommendations, and they're very difficult, but we landed on a mixture of government-led action, individual action, support for health professionals as trusted messengers. They require the right balance of demand side and supply side mechanisms, as well as a mixture of information and incentives for each. We talk about the education of health professionals. They need guidance and support on talking about healthy and planet-friendly diets. Increasingly, we see this conversation happening with patients, and that support is really important because, as we know, doctors and nurses and other health professionals are very trusted messengers in our society. We think that there's a place for labelling. Again, we understand this is a very complex area, but 2/3 of consumers support this, and the success of initiatives such as domestic appliance ratings really show that that changes consumer behaviour and manufacturer behaviour. We talk about fiscal incentives to change behaviour. Health professionals work in other alliances around alcohol, advocating a minimum alcohol pricing and also advocating a sugar tax. So we think that manufacturers should preempt this change by moving in the right direction. And obviously we also support the environmental land management subsidies for farmers to support biodiversity and afforestation. But essentially this is the polluter pays principle. If you're producing food that is carbon intensive, it needs to be supported with some fiscal incentives. Procurement is really important. The public sector, especially the NHS, is a major purchaser of food and a commissioner of catering services, and buying power could be used more effectively to shift production patterns as well as change and support dietary behaviour and reducing waste. 1/3 of all our waste is wasted, and many of those foods are unhealthy foods that you can bulk buy. This ends up in a problem with the NHS in terms of obesity and inactivity. So, oh, sorry, I should also say, I think there's also an issue around uncertainty of our trade deals at the moment. We need to ensure that the planetary health is considered within those trade deals, which has got a lot of other considerations at the moment. And also this takes leadership from government, from health professionals, manufacturers, from producers, local authorities and the NHS. But our members are ahead of the curve in some ways, because a recent poll that we did with them showed that health professionals, our members, 68% of them are concerned about food production and consumption and the climate. And if you look at different segments, for example, nurses and midwives, this goes up to 75%. 2/3 agree that changing your diet lessens its environmental impact, and it could also be healthier. And this rose again to 75% of nurses and midwives. And overall, 40% of all health professionals have already changed their diet for the environment, again rising with various segments to 50%. So the message is really clear. Changing the way we produce and consume food is essential to mitigate climate change, and failure to act quickly will heighten existing national health challenges, placing undue financial strain on the NHS and worsening health inequalities both in the UK and internationally. By responding to climate change, we can simultaneously bring about huge health benefits and help reduce the financial pressure on our NHS. Thank you very much. I'd now like to hand over to the Chair of the UK Health Alliance, Richard Smith.
Hi, welcome everybody. Very pleased to have you here. I think food is something we're all interested in one way or another. So we're going to have 4 speakers who are going to speak for about 5 minutes each, and then we're going to have plenty of time for questions. And what you need to do is to go to the Q&A function and put in your question there, and we'll answer as many as we can, and we'll pick out the ones that are the most exciting. So let's kick off. We're going to hear first. I will introduce each speaker before they speak so that you don't get overloaded at the beginning. So our first speaker is Kristin Bash, who's a public health consultant and honorary lecturer at the University of Sheffield. And she's done a lot of research in this area and was very helpful in producing this report. So Kristin, over to you.
Mute myself. Thank you very much for that introduction. Let me just share my screen here. Oops. Can you see my screen? No.
Not at the moment.
Oh dear.
I don't know whether Lawrence has a copy of your slides.
Lawrence, could you pop it up? For some reason it's
absolutely, yeah,
blocking it for me. I don't know why exactly.
I just get them ready now.
Well, I can start speaking before that. Thank you very much for the introduction. I'm really happy to be here today. I am a public health professional and I see everything through that lens, right? So food in particular, I see as, and not only do I see, it has an influence on us at cellular level, at health and well-being level, our community, our environment, And you can go to the next slide if you would. Our economy and our planet. So it's at once highly technical and infinitely poetic. And in terms of our health, in terms of prevention and addressing our health issues pretty much across every box to tick, food has to be considered essential to the discussion, as I'm sure we all know here. So what are we eating? There are about 50,000 edible plants on the planet. Only about 15 of them make up 90% of what we eat. And if you'll go to the next slide, please. There are a lot of us to feed. This is on population health. So every issue about discussion on food systems has to talk about how much we need to feed ourselves. This puts it in context for me. The population doubled, took 140 years to double from 1800 to 1940. It's tripled in the 6 years since then, and we're headed to 9.5 billion, which means we have to produce quite a bit of food. After World War II, the focus was on increasing yield, increasing production, reducing levels of stunting and wasting. And we've been quite successful. We've doubled food production globally since 1950. However, if we go to the next slide, please. This has come at a cost. I'm giving this overview in 5 minutes. I give 2-hour lectures on this topic, but as far back as 2011, it was very clearly identified in the Foresight report that if the food system continued as it was projected, contributions to climate change, degradation of the environment, biodiversity, and ultimately sort of fits the most basic definition of being unsustainable. Our food system compromises the world's capacity to produce food in the future. It also not fit for purpose in terms of health. While great strides were made, there's nearly 2 billion people micronutrient deficient and almost the same amount who are overweight or obese globally. So there's some health issues on a global scale. Looking at the UK, if we can go to the next scale or the next slide, please. This is just an overview. This was taken from 2017, the Global Burden of Disease Study, which looks at attributable risk factors. Broadly similar, tobacco and dietary risks, poor diet are sort of neck and neck, and this will not come as a surprise to anyone probably on the call, but cardiovascular disease, diabetes, type 2 diabetes, and certain cancers are at the height of those issues. So it's not, our food system is not fit for purpose in that respect. If we could go to the next slide, please. Environmental risks are coming up. So this is a whistle-stop tour, and again, I lecture on this at university, and this part of the discussion can take an hour. So our agriculture uses approximately 70% of all fresh water that we have on the planet, which is only 1 to 2% of all water that we have. Soil erosion from agriculture can be anywhere from 10 to 100 times higher than the rate soil can regenerate itself. So we don't think of soil as an asset, but it very much is. And the inputs to our industrial agriculture system in terms of fertilizer, nitrogen and phosphorus fertilizers are increasingly adding to eutrophication, acidification, and impacts on our environment that way. But if we'll go to the next slide, what we're here to talk about mostly is climate change. And this has been pointed out, approximately a quarter varies of global greenhouse gas emissions is a result of agriculture. If we can go to the next slide, please. So it's a breakdown, right? And this is a pattern. Now, I need to preface this by saying that production methods vary, right? And what we're talking about is how we feed the population. And how we feed the population largely is done at an industrial level. And at an industrial level, the patterns fit this general pattern where animal products and particularly ruminant meat emit the most greenhouse gas emissions. A big chunk of that is through land use. And if you'll see the brown section on that graph, that's at the farm stage. And then plant products are at the bottom end. This is a general pattern, but it fits both with greenhouse gas emissions. It largely fits with eutrophication and acidification, as well as land use and effects on biodiversity. So if we could go to the next slide, please. This is just showing land use and deforestation. So livestock gets some special attention, as I'm sure we all know. And again, not talking about the regenerative farming systems, but globally, agriculture accounts for 77% of livestock or rather livestock accounts for 77% of all agricultural land use, but only contributes 18% of the global calorie supply and approximately 30% of the total protein supply. So it's disproportionately taking up our very precious resources. And when we're talking about feeding 9.5 billion people, we need to be efficient. And so that's where these questions come in, as a matter of efficiency. Next slide, please. It's been pointed out food waste. So globally, 1/3 of food is wasted. And this is something that we need to address clearly if we're going to address greenhouse gas emissions. Next slide, please. But what we're talking about here is the fact that the way we produce our food has an impact on greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. Climate change will have an impact. So it's a circular problem. It will again have an impact on our ability to produce food. This is a 2010 World Bank simulation showing crop yield reduction estimated. And if we go to the next one, there's also a demonstrated impact on the nutritional value of some really core staple crops globally. And why this is carbon dioxide is what plants eat. You know, when we eat too much, we're not making more muscle cells and brain, muscle tissue and brain cells. We're making more that we don't need, and plants do the same. So they're making more sugar and less of the nutrients that we're looking to get out of plants. So if we go to the next slide, we're going to start talking about how these two overlap. So food-based dietary guidelines, the Eat Well plate, is what we have in the UK, and they're established to give a general overview of what guidelines, what governments and organizations feel we should be eating. They establish a basis for public health, food, nutrition, and agriculture policies. And if we look at some general patterns, we can look at the next one. Next slide, please, sorry. So here we have a selection of food-based dietary guidelines, and it's not here for the detail. What it's here to demonstrate, and what you can see here, is that there's patterns. So some are more, some are less, but the general patterns are more plant foods, whole grains, legumes, fruits, vegetables, fewer red and processed meat in particular, and with some focus on animal protein. So that's the general pattern, which, if you think back, also follows the pattern of environmental impacts, which we can see on the next slide. So this is just taken from a paper, the Poor Nemesic paper. If you've not seen it, from 2018, it looks at various ways of producing different types of foods. And what you see in the top, so beef, lamb, which are ruminant meats. If you go down to they had to put on a completely different scale because of how much lower everything else is. So those two are clearly the worst. But if you compare that to pulses, you can see clearly there are differences. And in general, keeping with the patterns of encouraging more plant protein and less of this red and processed meat, there's some just really clear patterns and some messages and some co-benefits. And then there's one final slide that brings it all together. And this is looking, if you go to the next, yes. So we have the y-axis, axis, goodness gracious, is looking at across 5 environmental outcomes, and the relative risk of mortality across the bottom. And you see the same pattern here again, with unprocessed red and processed meat in the top, vegetable foods in the lower left, meaning they have the lowest risk of mortality and the lowest risk of environmental impact. So there's some clear overlap. And in 5 minutes, that's really all I had time for. There's much more information on all of these things, but I think at this point I'll hand back after that very whistle-stop tour through the topic.
Good. Thank you very much, Kristin, for giving a 2-hour lecture in 5 minutes. I think you've spelt out the problem very clearly there and made clear that what is good for the planet is also good for us as individuals. So we're going to move now towards, well, what are we going to do about all of this? And we're very lucky to have Henry Dimbleby with us. He's the founder of the Lyon restaurant chain, but very significantly, he's leading on Britain's national food strategy. So, Henry, over to you.
Thank you, Richard. First of all, I wanted to say that it is fantastic that you as a collection of health professionals have moved out of your lane. This is a massive systemic problem. It is, I mean, it was a great run through by Kristin. It is hard to exaggerate how big the problems of climate change and of diet-related health are going to become. COVID, as bad as it is, will pale in comparison to the impact that climate change could have. And we all need to be working together to try and create system change. So first of all, I just think it's, don't let people tell you to stay in your lane. This is a fight we all need to fight. I think Kristin did a very good job of showing that actually what we have at the moment, it's worth reflecting on that, is actually a result of trying to change the system in the past. So if you go back and read through newspapers from the 50s, everything, there was so much about how we were going to run out of food. We weren't going to be able to feed ourselves. And it was a tremendous, the work of Norman Borlaug, the harbour process, creating pulling nitrogen out of the air through the use, it turns out, of vast amounts of energy, was a triumph. But it did, as Kristin said, create this world where, as the food supply increased, not only did the environment deteriorate hugely, but also we began to eat more and our health began to deteriorate. And I think that, that some of the numbers, Kristin mentioned them on, 70% of the world water, the world's fresh water is used by agriculture. Almost all eutrophication comes from agriculture. 2/3 of key species are in decline. 2 out of every 5 species of plants is threatened. It's just that the numbers become kind of repetitive. But if you think about the fact that the Earth's been here for 4.6 billion years, I think if you measured that on your arms outstretched as the timeline, within one atom of your fingernail, we have destroyed half the world's tropical forest. It's still being destroyed at 30 football pitches every minute. It is impossible to overstate how important this is. I broke my strategy into 2 parts, and I published part 1 before the summer. I focused very tactically because I decided I needed to on COVID and food poverty and on trade. And I'm now, as well as trying to push through some of those recommendations, working more broadly on part 2, which is going to be a much more systemic attempt to try and unpick these problems. And I wanted to end just by talking through kind of 4 insights into the system that are at the moment helping me try to unpick how we might as a society go about solving these problems. The first is that actually I think it is not theoretically a difficult problem. It's not as if it is a kind of mind-bending set of issues where a solution is hard to picture. Actually, the systemic solution has been solved by a lot of very clever people thinking about this. The issue is a political one. So this is a massive system change, and there will be winners and losers, and it will involve, I think, government intervention to shift the system on quite a large scale. And when you do that, the political risk is very high, so it will require a lot of political capital. The second insight is actually, if you look at the 9.5 billion that Kristin talked about, there is enough food. There's easily enough food to solve them. Waste in the system is huge. But actually, I think that the pieces of waste that Kristin talked about, overconsumption, home and business, although we could reduce those, might be harder to reduce than the other forms of waste. And the other forms of waste I categorize as using land to do the wrong things. We don't use land strategically at all. We waste the potential of our land hugely. The productivity of our farming, there are massive variances in productivity. So the land we are using for farming, we're using poorly. And then the example that Kristin talked about, meat, the amount of land that we're using to produce meat is just terrifying. And if you look at, I think there may be much more actually in those 3 forms of waste, much more gettable than there are in the forms of waste that we normally talk about when we talk about food waste. The third thing, and again, I think I was very glad that Nikki brought this up. There are 3 principles in the economist's answer to restoring our environment. The first is that you have a principle of net environmental capital gain, we not only stop the rot, but we improve the environment and the resources, the stocks of environmental capital that we have between now and the next generation. We hand on something better than we received. The second is public money for public good. We don't spend money on private goods, in this case, common agricultural policy to hold land. We spend public money on public goods, on biodiversity, on clean water, on clean air, on recreational land, on a rich environment. And that is happening through the change in the common agricultural policy. But the polluter pays principle, the idea that the negative externalities, as economists call them, of private transactions. If I buy a carrot from you, and that carrot leads to nitrogen getting into a river and killing the fish, we should be responsible for that. And if we don't stop doing it, we should pay to clean it up. That, because that is actually politically quite difficult. Not only are those costs not being built into the system, no one is even measuring them in a systemic way. So I think that we need to get very serious about the polluter pay principles, about setting out what the hidden costs of our food are. And government needs to take a view on how you reduce those costs. And then the final thing is, I've had this increasingly kind of, as someone who was a physicist at university and takes quite, I was a business consultant and takes quite an econometric view on things, I've been increasingly bothered by the fact that half the people I speak to in the food system don't talk about it in that way at all, and they come from it from a values point of view, and they reject, you know, the econometric framing. And I think, you know, one thing you could say, as some economists do, that's just because they're soft-headed and you know, they should just, you know, they're just not really thinking, they're not in the real world. But at the launch of the Natural Capital Committee yesterday, one of the board members said that unless we harness the power of local populations and culture, we're ignoring the possibility to get much, much more done in this field. There's a huge latent capability in local communities to do good in this area. And actually, I'm going to try and, I've called it, at the moment with the team, they're laughing at me, but I've called it the power of love. And I think that the food system both delivers actually things that changing the power system wouldn't deliver. It can deliver those things that we miss: connection, community, beauty, intimacy, even sacredness for some people. And also, I think recognizing those things is a way of changing it. So I'm trying at the moment, my fourth thing is actually, rather than just giving one side of the argument, to try and bring those two tribes together. Because I think if you do bring those two tribes together, you've got a chance of real change. And if we don't get real change, we are leaving our grandchildren something that we should be deeply ashamed of.
Good, thank you very much, Henry. Goodness, a physics-trained restaurateur who takes an econometric view and advocates love. You're clearly the perfect person to be doing this national strategy. Just a very simple question. When do you expect the second part of your strategy to be published?
Hoping for it to come out in the spring, early summer of next year. COVID and Brexit depending, but at the moment we're cracking on at a good pace.
Good, thank you very much. So now we're going to move from the sort of national perspective to what can individual hospitals and trusts do. And we're going to hear from Ian Stenton, who's the head of sustainability in Liverpool, and also sits on a group set up by NHS Improvement to review the hospital food standards. Ian, over to you.
Thanks, Richard. I'll try and share my screen. So is everybody, you can see the screen okay now? Yeah, we can. Yes. Okay, so yeah, I'm Ian Stenton, I'm Head of Sustainability at Liverpool University Hospitals. I'm just going to talk about what we've done internally and some of the national things that I'm involved in. If I can get onto the next slide, I don't know.
Ian, if you go to the bottom, you can kind of move it on, not with just your kind of icon. There's another place to do it. but if not, maybe Lawrence can help with that.
Yeah, sorry, Lauren. So after testing this to make sure it was okay, now I can't.
If you like, I could share your slides.
Yeah, go on. Sorry about this, everyone. Okay, well, I'll start anyway. So, so we were guided by the Hospital Food Standards Panel. So, as Richard said, I'm part of that group at the moment. And the first report was published in 2014, around about the time that I started working at Liverpool University Hospitals. And that stated that all trusts should have a food and drink strategy. That's great, thanks. If you go on to the next slide, so we'd had a healthy eating plan since 2013 and developed our first food and drink strategy in 2015 following the panel's recommendations. We actually had a case study in the first food panel report, and that was about our patient engagement to do with some new food ordering system. An update report was published in 2017, and in the updated report, we were the only hospital that was mentioned specifically, or the only trust was, due to our use of the balanced scorecard, except for mid-staffs were mentioned, but obviously that wasn't in a positive light. And it highlighted the work we've been doing with the scorecard and working with DEFRA, and in 2017 we updated our food and drink strategy in line with the updated panel report. We were due to update our food and drink strategy in 2019 because we were hoping to do it every other year, but in 2018 I was asked to join the new Hospital Food Standards panel report, and we've been working since 2018 on refreshing the guidance. I sit on the sustainability, food waste and procurement subgroup. That work's progressing and aiming to be published or out for consultation by the end of the year, but as has been pointed out by Henry, everything is a bit slower than was previously. If you can go on the next slide, please, Lawrence. So the requirement, or the recommendation to have a food and drink strategy became a requirement in the NHS standard contract. So that's been something that all trusts have had to have for a number of years. And also in the standard contract, it says that when procuring food or food services, you should also meet the standards within the government buying standards for food, and that's what we did, and that was one of the first projects I was involved in. So next slide, please. 2014, when I started, we were due to go out for a new hotel services contract, so that was soft FM, catering, porters and cleaners. At the time I was introduced to the social value lead for the Liverpool commissioners, who also put me in touch with the Sustainable Food Cities Coordinator for Liverpool, so had access to real expertise in this, and that's how we were able to do so well. We decided with the all services section to focus on the social value strategy, which the CCG had just published, and for the catering we decided to stick with key existing requirements, which was balanced scorecard and soil association, which at the time was the catering mark. If you go on the next slide, please, Lawrence, this just shows how we use the social value strategy to look at the all services section. So the CCG had decided on economic, social and wellbeing goals, and obviously as a provider we produce services on behalf of the CCG. So this was a great way for us to show directly how we were including their recommendations and their guidance in our own contracts. This isn't the full social value goals. We took ones that were applicable to the contract, and this really saved lots of time on having to do internal engagement or speaking to patients and staff about what was important regarding sustainability and food procurement, because the CCG had done a massive engagement campaign, so we were able to base it on there, which was great. The next slide shows what we did regarding the government, the balanced scorecard. So that came out in the summer of 2014 as we were writing the guidance, and the overviews are on the left hand side. The mandatory criteria meets the government buying standards for food anyway, which is now part of the standard contract, and the awards questions are rated depending on how people go. When we went through the tender, the decision was made to keep all of there was no weighting added, so we didn't say one area was more important than another. This was done specifically to try and bring out the best in all the bidders, because it was an outsourced contract. I think it's 75 million over 5 years, so it's a relatively big contract, and we wanted that if one bidder was amazing with supply chain management, that they could come forward with that. If a different bidder did things to do with energy management or employment and skills, you wanted the best of all the bidders. the feedback we got was that they would have much preferred us to say what was important. I think they were a bit overwhelmed by the breadth of what we were asking for. So next slide just shows what's happened since then. We've continued work with the winning contractor. We were the first ISS contract that had a contract-specific sustainability and social value manager, and that was purely because of the work that we put into the tender. So I was really proud of that, and it meant that we were able to raise the profile of food and sustainability in the trust and nationally. We're working with Incredible Edible now on a project at one of our sites, and we got significant funding to enhance green space. Next slide shows that we're continue to work for developing our role as an anchor institution. So there's a Liverpool City piece of work, a health and care partnership piece of work, and a national piece of work on anchor institutions that we're involved in, and particularly about purchasing for low social benefit or locally and reducing environmental impact. Totally ties in with our food procurement. And then the last slide just shows that we're also continue to work with the Sustainable Development Goal Framework. We were the first trust to report on the Sustainable Development Goals, and we're developing KPIs for our new strategy, so that we'll be able to show over the next 10 years how we're meeting individual targets within the goals. And for food procurement particularly, this is a great way because the UK government has to report on how we're meeting these goals, and we can show what we're doing locally to support them as well. So that's it from me. Thanks, Richard.
Good, thank you very much, Ian. I mean, there may be some people on the call who don't realise that the NHS itself, or the health and social care system, is about 5% of Britain's global greenhouse gas emissions, and the NHS is the biggest employer in many towns in Britain. It's by far away the biggest employer, so it has a lot of potential to change this.
Yeah.
So let me urge you all to add questions, because I think you're going to have, and the more questions we have, the richer the discussion will be. But we're now going to move, so we've sort of gone down in scale in some ways, but we're now going to hear from Georgie Soman, who's a GP in the Northeast, and talk about what she's up to. Over to you, Georgie.
Hello, I'm Georgie. I'm a GP in the northeast of England. Thank you so much for having me here today. Firstly, it is terrifying to talk about food as a healthcare professional. The optimum diet for human health, understandably, has been subject to so much heated debate, conflicting opinion, passion, and controversy. And of course, food also forms part of our cultures, belief systems, psychological well-being, and identities. But we still have to talk about food as healthcare professionals because it's one of the biggest drivers of human health. And in any given day, we may encounter conditions in our patients ranging from type 2 diabetes to malnutrition, and even to some forms of cancer in which food plays a part. And according to the Eat Lancet Commission, food is the single strongest lever to optimize not just human health, but also environmental sustainability on Earth. So expanding our thinking in healthcare to include the impact of food on people and planet is now key. As healthcare professionals, we know that preventative healthcare, such as promoting healthy eating, has significant potential benefit to our patients' healthy lifespans. However, whilst there is good evidence, tools and resources to have brief conversations around other interventions, such as physical activity, starting conversations with our patients around food is far more complex. Patient-centered, compassionate care means we need to take into account what matters most to our patients. And to very many in our communities, food is absolutely not a choice or a behaviour, and nor is it about individual blame. And in addition, upstream changes far outside our clinic rooms around the social determinants of health are needed to address inequalities so that healthful, sustainable food is accessible to all. But we still need to talk about food in the meantime with our patients. We have opportunities to have conversations at key points in our patients' lives, from pregnancy to operations or diagnosis of long-term conditions. And we have time and workload pressures now more than ever, but we have opportunities to support change by working in increasingly multidisciplinary teams and by understanding what systems are available to our patients locally. And this could be health trainers, social prescribers, specialist pathways, charities, educational programs, and even incredible grassroots local organisations who work with our patients, particularly those for whom access to health is least equal. And we can support change by making sure that we ask our patients to be partners in this. We can ask and listen for as many voices as possible in our communities to find the right words to use when it comes to these conversations. And healthcare has influence in what it buys and the food environment it creates. We can support change by asking our organisations to make sure that sustainability to people and planet are a priority with food. So talking about food as a healthcare professional is terrifying and complex. And in health, food is not a silo, and nor is any particular one way of eating. But as we've discussed today, food is one of the strongest levers to optimise not just human, but environmental sustainability on Earth. Change far outside of healthcare is needed, but we can have a role. And it will now be a challenge to find approaches that are patient-centred, collaborative, compassionate, and that engage best with our communities. But continuing the conversation is key. Thank you.
Good, thank you very much, Georgie. So now we can move into questions. And here's one that came right at the beginning from Henry Clifford, that maybe I could get you to comment, Kristin, and then you, Henry, afterwards. So is there not a risk that by considering diets primarily through the lens of climate, we could drive unintended consequences? Wouldn't a broader approach of sustainable diets that factor in nutrition, livelihoods, and wider environmental impacts be more appropriate? So are we concentrating too much on climate change? Kristin?
That question is spot on, and it's absolutely right that we cannot look at these issues in silos simply because this is systems thinking, right? It's a food system, and it works across a number of mechanisms that influence our human health and well-being, as I sort of alluded to at the beginning of my talk. So what I can say is that I know from the context of the UK Health Alliance on climate change, there may be a very specific focus on climate change, but that when we're working on this issue in a broader context, those other issues do come into play. So especially things around cultural sensitivity of foods, the wider environmental impacts that I alluded to as well, because there's far more impact than just climate change. If you looked at the literature, even 5 years ago, the majority of papers were looking strictly at climate change, and now you'll see eutrophication, acidification in wider areas. So absolutely, and I can assure you that that work is being considered, and that is one of the reasons why coming up with indicators is so difficult. And that's a brief answer, but I can hand over to Henry now, who may have a...
Yeah, are you considering all these things in your strategy, Henry?
Yes, I think there are two ways that I'd answer that. The first is that unintended consequences, there's always a huge risk of them. And if you look at the Green Revolution, that response, the unintended consequence of that was environmental destruction and health, terrible health outcomes. But billions of people would have starved if we hadn't worked out how the harbour process and high yielding short stem wheats. So we have to be really careful when we're bold with the system that we have ways of not creating unintended consequences. In this particular instance, one of the second answer is the good news is that these things are actually very closely aligned in many ways. So, you know, if you were to have, well, Kristin kind of put it in her presentation, if you were to have one answer to all of these problems, it would be eat more plants. And if we ate more plants, then we'd be healthier and there'd be less carbon. And there are areas also where, you know, if you look at eutrophication, for example, you know, nitrogen is quite a lot of CO2 goes into making it, and it gets poured on. It's underpriced, so it gets poured in large quantities near watercourses and goes in. So solving that problem would solve both environmental problem and a climate problem. There are areas where you have to make trade-offs. So, for example, if you look at just the climate impact, very intensively reared beef hormone grown, so it grows fast, kept still, actually has a lower carbon threshold than the more extensively reared beef, which grows more slowly and releases more methane in its lifetime. So there are areas where you have to be careful and you have to make trade-offs, but on the whole, actually, I think that these things are spookily aligned, and we should be thankful for that.
Henry, can I follow up with a question that comes from Zoe Cohen? She describes the government as woeful on this whole agenda. Do you think that's clear? I mean, that's fair. Clearly, the government has got a hell of a lot on its plate.
Yeah.
Is it going to be able to think about this?
I think there are two stages. There was a long period of refusing that the problem existed, both on health and on the environment. And I think, thankfully, that we are beyond that stage. And now almost everyone, with the exception of a few quite ideologically driven people, recognise that these two problems are huge. On the environmental side, I actually think potentially the government is moving in quite a radically right direction. So if they do what they say they're going to do on the environment bill and on the agricultural policy, and we spend £2.4 billion of common agricultural money on public good, if that happens, it will transform our landscape and our environment in a really fundamental way. It'll be the biggest single policy shift, positive policy shift in this area. There's a lot of chance for slip twixt cup and lip, but the direction of travel is good. I think in the health area, I think there is still, even though the Prime Minister obviously as a result of his recent illness shifted a bit, I think there is more ideological, that people find it quite hard. Actually, if you look at the population, everyone as a population, even people who are ill from eating the wrong food, still view it very strongly as a question of personal responsibility. And I think there's more of a shift that we need to make in the health area. But I think we've kind of made the shift in the environment area, and now it's a matter of keeping firm, having courage, civil society, as you are doing, making sure we're keeping the government honest to deliver on what it's promised.
Well, Henry, I won't keep beating up on you, but inevitably, I think people will be thinking about Brexit. So Matilda Smith from Cornwall says, how much should we be concerned that post-Brexit trade deals will overlook climate impact and long-term security for cheap deals in food supply?
This is a fight I'm in the middle of at the moment. So my part one laid out 3 recommendations on trade to ensure that didn't happen. The government has repeatedly said they will not let that happen. There was a welcome announcement at the weekend where they put the Trade and Agricultural Committee on a statutory level, which is good because it will be more scrutiny. But I think there still is an ideological or a policy schism at the heart of the Tory party between those kind of, you might look at Zach Goldsmith and the recently converted Michael Gove as people for whom the environment is a kind of primary concern, and then others who are more believe in the power of free trade. And I think that risk, until these deals are signed, that risk is always there. But I'm actually, again, I'm realistic at the moment. I'm quite optimistic that won't happen. Purely because there is one area where there is such overwhelming public resistance to it, and interestingly, most by the lowest income. So the people who have the lowest income, to whom this is a real thing, they don't want to be forced into a 2-tier food system where they eat the terrible food because they can't afford the other food. They want the government to solve it. So because of that, I'm maybe wrongly optimistic about how that will play out.
Good, thank you. Ian, here's a question for you from Sue Atkinson. How did you achieve local food procurement and how successful was it?
That was the main that was the thing we were most trying to achieve, and it was the biggest failure, to be honest. So we had difficulty with procurement rules that you're not allowed to specify local particularly. We even had difficulty including the Soil Association catering markers. To achieve some of the marks, you have to include food from a specific radius. So we just put in cheats, really, to be honest. It's the easiest way around it. So for the first time, we took out the catering from the wider soft FM, so that if a local company could supply the patient meals part, they could bid just for that and not the porters and the caterers, although we'd done some engagement and that didn't work. We put in that we wanted them to get bronze catering mark, which didn't focus so much on local supply, but they were interested in targets to silver and gold. And we purposely didn't mention whether that was for retail or for patient meals, with the hope that they thought it was for patient meals and would have to come up with something. And then we'd worked with a few of the bidders, talked about a local food production hub, so that rather than use the big national, because it's a cook freeze model, so we bring in frozen meals and they're reheated and given to the patients. And that was the model we had to stick with because of the infrastructure in the site. So we looked at whether we could do local production hubs, and 2 of the final bidders did come up with that, but it didn't progress anywhere. We really struggled to find the funding for that. So we're still currently on a cook freeze model where the person who makes the meals does use a lot of local products, but they're local to Essex where they're made, not local to Liverpool. And that's something we really struggled with.
Good, thank you, Ian. Georgie, can I ask you this question? Do people care more or less about the impact of food on climate since COVID? You're on mute.
I don't have any definite evidence or figures around this. I've only got my own personal experience from being in practice. I talked a little bit about how we can bring up opportunities to talk about food with our patient where it's appropriate, but I found that people have brought it up with me a lot more since COVID, actually, when I'm speaking to them. And certainly there has been much more of a public awareness around the impact of diet on patients' risk factors for long-term conditions and then perhaps outcome from COVID. So I would say yes, and I think this is a key opportunity and time.
Good. There's another question here that I think should go to you. Is there any evidence from interventions, for example, behaviour change, that you can help people change their diet, in relation to the climate?
That's a really good question, and that's something that I looked into in great detail before this talk. The difficulty is I'm looking through a general practitioner lens, which means I have very limited time. So thinking about behavioural change within a tiny fraction of a 10-minute appointment is very different perhaps to a pathway I might send my patient down to see somebody who's a health coach who has a lot more time. However, the difficulty is as well looking at things through a planetary lens, because this means that we put health inequality at the heart and at the starting point of our conversations. The Marmot report, which was reviewed last year again, talks about this and talks about behaviour change in our patients for whom there isn't choice. And actually there isn't evidence that this is the case at all. But I welcome conversations in this area.
Good, thank you, Georgia. Here's a question I'd like to put to each of you. It comes from Terry Kemple, who's on our executive at the Alliance. There's clearly a lot to do. What do you think we should prioritise to achieve by this time next year when COP26 will be happening? And what would success look like? So Kristin, I'm going to ask you that first. A priority, and what does success look like?
No small task. I know. To be fair, it's a very difficult question. If I can just harken back to the previous question, just really briefly, there is some evidence around behavioral change methodology. So, the nudge agenda, that there's some things to do with social norms and some dietary environment changes. So this is where we get into personal choice versus what does our dietary environment look like that makes it easy for us to make the good choices? And that's really where we need to start looking, instead of approaching this from, and I guess this would be my answer, just shifting the focus, which it has started, and I think to continue that shift from personal responsibility, which certainly has its role, but people have not become less responsible over the last 50 years, and levels of obesity and diet-related health have increased tremendously. So we need to look at the wider impacts of the food environment that we all live in, particularly considering exactly what was just said by Georgie, that this is a health inequalities issue. Obesity is a disease of poverty. Twice as many children in the most deprived postcodes are obese as in the least deprived. So we have to look at this as an environment and a system issue, a food environment, rather than strictly at providing information to the individual to make choices. That would be my answer.
Good, thank you. Henry, what about you? What's your priority and what does success look like?
So, for me personally, there are two things. One is what I hope to do in part 2 is to try and create a movement around the food system. What do I mean by that? I mean setting out a really clear set of ideas that will last for the relatively long term over period that this is going to take to solve. Because at the moment we've kind of got that in climate, but there really isn't a coherent view of what needs to be done in the food system. And then beneath that, the things that we do on Monday morning in March immediately, but those things will change. It's not, we're not gonna have one plan that we just put in place next year and follow. So I'm really hoping to create a set of ideas that people can coalesce around, and also to try and bring those people together I'm doing a lot of public engagement. Personally, then, the other thing which I think we should all be doing as much as we can is within my networks, trying to bring people from healthcare in the food system and education together and talk to them about what we can do in our hood. So I do a lot of work in Hackney to try and improve the food system in Hackney. We do a lot of work in Lyon to try and help everyone eat better for themselves and for the planet. And actually, anyone on this call, that probably is the most powerful thing you can do, is set up a discussion with your local, you might be the local GP, with your local food suppliers, restaurants, schools, get together in your community and create an action plan for your postcode. Just get going, don't wait for government to do that. You can go out after this meeting and Google who those people are and set up a Zoom. We're all sitting at home doing nothing. Set up a Zoom for this Friday coming and get going.
Thanks. Ian, what's your answer?
With mine focusing on the hospital, the first one obviously is to get the hospital food standards panel report out by the end of the year, because that will require all trusts to start reporting annually on what they're doing regarding food, which includes sustainability, procurement and food waste, which would be important. And I think I'd really like to see more central mandating of standards from government. So nationally, there's probably only 3 main producers of outsourced cook, chill and cook freeze meals. And then for all hospitals who do in-house cooking, they're being more and more mandated to use NHS supply chain through food buy. So we're really looking at just 4 organisations that control all of the food that goes into hospitals across the country. And a lot of the requirements fall at hospital level, but we don't have the responsibility or the scope to deal with them. So I think more mandating from government about what goes into food, what we serve to our patients and how that's grown and produced would be a really quick win and relatively easy to do. If, like Henry said, someone could agree what would look like.
And Georgie?
I'm going to agree with everything said here, and also what Henry was just talking about there. At the very beginning, he said about healthcare coming out of its lane. And I think in my talk, I talked about healthcare isn't a silo, and it's not. And it is very frightening to talk about these issues as a healthcare professional. But I think transdisciplinary approaches, which may be from upstream system change, but also, as we talked about today, from community-led up, maybe where we find some of these answers. Thank you.
Good, thank you very much. So we're going to have to end in just a moment. But can I thank all of our speakers, and can I thank all of you who put in questions? And I apologise that we haven't been able to answer all of them, but we will pick up on them and we'll feed them into our thinking and our report, and we might even be able to get some answers to you. We're publishing this report today, but this is just a beginning. We will be pursuing all of this very actively with our 650,000 members of our member organisations. And I'd like to leave you with the challenge that Henry gave you. Go out into your local community, meet your food suppliers, talk to them, get discussions going, and develop a strategy. And if you are a GP or a nurse or a physiotherapist or a hospital, you're in a very strong position to do that. So go forth and be active. This is a big problem, but there are big benefits from saving it.